这两个正好是我的仇人，即使前辈不吩咐，我也会杀了。
好，我知道了。
There was a time when Huang Xiaoming represented everything success in Cbiz was supposed to look like. He was admired, trusted, and endlessly celebrated. A man whose name carried prestige rather than controversy. Yet somewhere along the way, admiration quietly turned into ridicule. Without a single scandal to mark the fall, Huang Xiaoming became a punchline, a symbol of excess, outdated taste, and performances the public no longer wanted to defend. This shift did not happen overnight. It happened gradually through changing audiences, evolving aesthetics, and a media environment that rewards irony faster than respect. What once felt confident began to feel exaggerated. What once felt charming began to feel performative. And the industry that had elevated Huang Xiaoming to near untouchable status began to watch silently as the public rewrote his image without him. The most unsettling part of his story is that nothing catastrophic ever occurred. There was no accident, no public disgrace, no moment where the system pushed him out. Huang Xiaoming kept working. He kept appearing. He kept fulfilling his role as a successful star. But the tone around him changed. Laughter replaced admiration. Mockery replaced expectation. The same visibility that once protected him now amplified every perceived flaw. This is the cruel paradox of long-standing fame. When you have been placed on a pedestal for too long, the fall does not require a mistake. It only requires fatigue. Audiences grow restless. Standards shift, and suddenly the image that once defined excellence is recast as excess. Huang Xiaoming did not change fast enough, and the industry did not slow down for him. Tonight, this is not a story of before the ridicule, before the memes, and before the public fatigue set in. Huang Xiaoming was not simply successful. He was exemplary. In the early and mid-2000s, his rise followed a textbook path that the Chinese entertainment industry openly admired. Handsome in a conventional, reassuring way, professionally trained, and consistently visible in major productions, he embodied a version of stardom that felt both aspirational and safe. Producers trusted him, brands aligned with him, and audiences accepted him as a symbol of reliability rather than risk. His breakthrough roles established a clear identity. Huang Xiaoming was positioned as the leading man audiences could believe in, whether as a heroic figure in historical dramas or a composed presence in modern stories. He projected confidence, discipline, and emotional clarity, qualities that translated well across genres and generations. At his peak, he was not chasing trends. He was setting a standard. In a rapidly expanding industry, his image represented stability and success done the right way. This carefully constructed public image extended beyond acting. Huang Xiaoming was frequently presented as intelligent, ambitious, and business-savvy, a star who understood both art and commerce. Media narratives emphasized his professionalism and upward trajectory, reinforcing the idea that he was not merely famous, but exemplary. He became a reference point, a measure against which other male stars were compared. To admire Huang Xiaoming was to admire a system that rewarded discipline, polish, and conformity. Yet beneath this polished exterior was an image that allowed very little flexibility. His success depended heavily on consistency, on repeating what had worked before. The traits that made him powerful also made him predictable. As long as audience tastes remained aligned with traditional masculinity and grand performances, this worked in his favor. But the industry does not remain static, and neither does public perception. The problem was not that Huang Xiaoming lacked talent or effort. It was that his image had been perfected to the point where deviation felt risky. Growth required breaking a mold that had once guaranteed success. And when the cultural atmosphere began to shift toward understatement, realism, and irony, the version of Huang Xiaoming the public knew started to feel increasingly out of place. Understanding this foundation is essential, because it explains why the backlash that followed felt so sudden and so harsh. Huang Xiaoming did not rise by accident, and his later struggles were not born from incompetence. They were the result of a star who had been elevated as an ideal, only to discover that ideals age faster than people do. The turning point in Huang Xiaoming's story did not arrive with a single failed project or a dramatic public mistake. It emerged gradually, as the industry and its audience began to change faster than his established image could adapt. What once felt authoritative and confident started to feel excessive. Performances that had previously been praised for their intensity were now criticized as overacting. Familiar gestures became predictable, and predictability, in a new media environment, quickly turned into mockery. As younger actors entered the scene with quieter styles and more restrained performances, the contrast grew sharper. Audiences began to favor realism over grandeur, subtlety over declaration. Against this shifting backdrop, Huang Xiaoming's long-standing screen persona felt increasingly misaligned with the moment. A few high-profile projects underperformed, and instead of being treated as isolated missteps, they were framed as confirmation of a larger narrative, that he was out of touch, outdated, and unwilling or unable to change. At the same time, public attention expanded beyond his work to his off-screen presence. Interviews, variety show appearances, and personal comments were dissected with a harsher lens. Confidence was reinterpreted as arrogance. Politeness was read as calculation. The tone of coverage shifted almost imperceptibly but decisively. Praise gave way to irony, and irony soon hardened into routine ridicule. Social media accelerated this process, turning criticism into entertainment and repetition into consensus. What made this phase especially damaging was that Huang Xiaoming did not lose access to work. He remained visible, active, and successful by traditional metrics. Yet each new appearance seemed to reinforce the same critique. Visibility no longer protected him. It amplified the disconnect. The industry did not intervene to correct the narrative, nor did it defend him. It simply adjusted, allowing public sentiment to reshape his position without formal acknowledgement. This was the moment when success itself became a liability, the very image that had once elevated. Huang Xiaoming now limited his ability to recalibrate. Any attempt to defend himself risked appearing defensive. Any attempt to ignore the criticism allowed it to grow. Caught between persistence and perception, he faced a reality many long-established stars eventually encounter. When the culture shifts, past achievements offer no immunity. The trigger, then, was not failure but misalignment. Huang Xiaoming did not suddenly lose talent or discipline. He lost timing. And in an industry governed by momentum and mood, that loss proved far more consequential than any single mistake. As criticism hardened into consensus, Huang Xiaoming found himself trapped in a role he had never chosen. Online ridicule spread through memes and commentary, turning fragments of performances and interviews into shorthand for everything the public claimed to be tired of. The mockery was not violent, but it was relentless, and its repetition gave it authority. Once a narrative takes hold in Cbiz, it rarely needs evidence to sustain itself. The industry's response was quiet adjustment rather than confrontation. Huang Xiaoming was not removed, but he was no longer protected. Projects continued, yet the margin for error shrank. Each role arrived already burdened with expectation, not of success, but of confirmation. If he performed well, it was dismissed as overdue. If he faltered, it was treated as proof. The system did not silence him. It let the noise speak for itself. Internally, the conflict deepened, persisting with the image that had brought him success. Now invited ridicule, but abandoning it meant dismantling the foundation of his career. Reinvention carried risk, especially for a star whose authority had been built on consistency. To change too suddenly would appear calculated. To change too slowly would appear stubborn. Either way, public interpretation remained out of his control. This phase exposed a harsher truth about longevity. Fame is not withdrawn abruptly. It is reweighted. Huang Xiaoming remained visible, wealthy, and employed, yet increasingly defined by how others talked about him rather than by the work itself. The pressure was not to disappear, but to endure. And endurance, without recalibration, began to look less like strength and more like inertia. The conflict had reached a point where continuing as before would only deepen the gap between effort and perception. Something had to give, not because the industry demanded it explicitly, but because the existing balance had become unsustainable. The climax of Huang Xiaoming's story arrived not through confrontation, but through recognition. Instead of denying the ridicule or blaming the audience, he chose an unexpected response. Acknowledgement. In interviews and public appearances, he began to openly joke about his own image, disarming criticism by naming it himself. What looked like humor was, in fact, a recalibration. For the first time, he stepped out of the role of the untouchable leading man and admitted the limits of the persona he had carried for years. This shift marked a decisive break from the past. Huang Xiaoming began to turn down roles that reinforced exaggeration and sought characters that diminished his own presence. He accepted parts that were secondary, restrained, even unflattering. Authority was replaced with vulnerability. Control was traded for risk. In doing so, he challenged the assumption that survival in Cbiz requires constant dominance. The reaction was cautious but noticeable. Ridicule softened into curiosity. Some audiences remained skeptical, but others recognized the sincerity of the change. By lowering his status voluntarily, Huang Xiaoming reclaimed agency. He was no longer trying to win back universal admiration. He was redefining what participation meant on his own terms. This was the true turning point. Not redemption and not victory, but awareness. He understood that the image that built his career could not carry it forward. And once that realization settled, the question was no longer how to restore the past, but how to remain present without being trapped by it. After the shift, Huang Xiaoming's career did not suddenly regain its former reverence, and that was precisely the point. He continued to work, but with recalibrated expectations. Visibility was no longer the goal. Relevance, when it came, was quieter and harder one. By choosing roles that emphasized restraint over spectacle, he allowed his performances to exist without demanding admiration. In an industry that often equates worth with dominance, this adjustment marked a significant change. Public perception followed slowly. The memes faded, replaced not by adoration, but by a more neutral respect. Huang Xiaoming was no longer discussed as an ideal, nor as a joke, but as a working actor navigating the middle ground between fame and fatigue. This space was less glamorous, but more sustainable. It allowed for inconsistency, growth, and imperfection without immediate punishment. The long-term impact of this phase extended beyond individual projects. Huang Xiaoming's story became a reference point for the volatility of public taste and the fragility of constructed perfection. His rise and recalibration revealed how easily admiration can harden into contempt when an image is held too rigidly for too long. He was not undone by scandal or failure, but by a cultural shift that redefined what audiences wanted from their stars. In the end, his journey offers a quiet but instructive conclusion. Success, when over-identified with image, becomes a liability. Longevity requires not only discipline, but humility, timing, and the willingness to release control. Huang Xiaoming did not disappear, and he did not reclaim his former pedestal. Instead, he learned to remain within the industry without demanding worship. And perhaps that is the most honest resolution available in Cbiz. Not triumph, not exile, but survival without illusion.